right. Hello. Welcome to Acadian Driftwood. My name is Kyle Mack. I'm joined with my co-host Kendall Cotton, and we have another guest today with me, who's braved the outside and come within 6 feet of me. Is is David Herbst. David is the state director of Americans for Prosperity in Montana, and he's come to kind of talk about the good, bad, and the ugly of the coronavirus with us.
Thank you for having me on. I'm pumped to have the conversation.
All right. Yeah. And how are you doing, Kendall? I don't want to leave you out too.
I'm doing great. It sounds like I'm going to be locked down, not going into work tomorrow. So I'm going to be working from home, working from my apartment for the foreseeable future.
Yeah, I do everything from right in this spot too. So,
and I think, no change.
Yeah, nothing. Like my life really hasn't changed that much with the coronavirus.
Shut-ins are prospering in this economy.
Yes.
I'll tell you that. If you're part of the information economy, you're doing well.
Yep. Us introverts are doing very well. All right. So we brought Dave on to talk about some kind of policy recommendations with what's going on, to kind of talk about the good things that are happening in the response to the coronavirus, and maybe talk about some of the not so good things that are happening. And just kind of, and we wanted to just kind of have a large conversation on overall everything that's going on right now when it comes to we're all liberty freedom lovers here, and we want to kind of give a perspective on not just kind of like the healthcare response and the government response, but also what's happening in the economy, what's happening with some other loose ends around this as well. So overall, Dave, kind of what are kind of, as you're kind of looking at the landscape right now, how are you feeling about just kind of the general response to this pandemic that we're in?
Well, I kind of see it like from an economics point of view, there are two things with coronavirus to be concerned about. One is the externalities, right? People who are infected can infect other people without meaning to, and so that we need to establish things to try to limit that externality. There is a role for government in that in order to prevent people from infecting other folks and creating a healthcare crisis. The other part of that is supply. We have constraints in supply that have happened that have really made our adjustments slower than they needed to be, and much slower than the countries who are doing the best, and more on par with the countries who are doing the worst, like Italy. Those supply and externality problems are kind of, you treat them separately, but they're really intertangled too. So supply problem would be like, for years we've had this thing called certificate of need law that has constrained the amount of beds available at any given time in hospitals, have constrained the services across industries all over the United States. Montana specifically, we have certificate of need law that is affecting us in home healthcare services. Then we also have telemedicine barriers that prevented people from being able to get medical help online. So one of the good things we see is on those supplies, we see a lot of those barriers dropping in supply. And then we also have a lot of proactive work being done by government to reduce the negative externality components of the infectious disease. That doesn't get to all the places where the government did the opposite. And, for years, government restricted supply, and then the FDA and CDC really botched up testing and is not doing a good job about leveraging the many other areas where testing can happen in the private sector. And so, I can keep going, but there's so much there. When it comes to education, criminal justice reform has tremendous, or at least the justice system itself has tremendous implications in this. Education, and when it comes to government spending, we still have a major problem coming down potentially with a lot of bailouts, a lot of spending that is unnecessary, not to mention monetary policy concerns from the Fed and potential inflation issues that could happen depending on how government responds to this.
Yeah, and the Federal Reserve and the stimulus that's going on is something that I've been paying most attention to. But you mentioned criminal justice reform. How is that relating to, like, the virus itself?
Yeah.
Like,
prisons are not sanitary places. I mean, they try to be. I mean, I don't want to undermine the work that our people do there, but when you have lots of people in an enclosed off space, that's the best case scenario for the virus and the worst case scenario for us. Especially when you have limited medical services in a lot of hospitals or a lot of prisons that can handle a couple people, but when everyone's sick, that gets into a real problem. It is true that the age range of the average prison is younger, typically. So therefore, this isn't full of the demographic that's at stake. But there are lots of secondary effects from that. Prison guards get sick; they have to work. There's just so many things that can go wrong. So at least one of the things that you could do is you keep people out of going into prison unless you absolutely have to, right? So some of this stuff, and we always want to be aware of in this conversation, and I think both our friends on the right and the left have made lots of mistakes there, where they say everything that I believed before is now justified because of this virus, right?
Yes.
It's a clumsy way to go about it. So I don't want to say I'm doing that. What I'm saying is we want to look at very specifically what will help and what will harm in this negative externality problem and in the supply problem, and addressing.
Dave, I think I completely agree with you, and I think that the really what this crisis is, as it's unfolded, I think what it's revealed is our society's priorities. So it's really made us think, like, what do we actually need as far as government policy, as far as government response, as far as like our the supply chains and the way that we operate our businesses and interact in our personal lives. It's made us prioritize, and I think that's it's really a bottleneck for specifically our younger generation. I think this is the first real crisis that we've actually had to do that. So it's very interesting, and we see it with the policy response too, like you were talking about, where a lot of regulations that were in place, for one reason or the other, are taken off the table so that we can allow people to help people. And I think that that's fundamentally a good thing. I really like to see that.
So imagine this. Imagine the future society we're going to get to, where you can get alcohol delivered to your home pre-made.
Oh my gosh.
Oh, yeah. That would seem like if you would have just proposed that a year ago in the middle of the legislative session here in Montana or whatever state you're in, you would be seen as a crazy person. Like, everyone's gonna get drunk all the time. There would be so many objections.
Bars
to
are
that
going to go
problem.
out of business.
Exactly. The Tavern Association will come out hard. But now that's suddenly possible. And as we actually open that question up to even non-essential services, there's lots of other questions. And I think especially when it comes to the direct services that people need, if you're over 80, you really need to be indoors and quarantining yourself for your own good. Other folks are doing it for the negative externality part, but you're at stake. You're the part of the vulnerable population. And if you need access to a doctor right now, you might not be that good at telemedicine. You're over 80. The internet's not usually your place. You're not, although it's good if they can do, we still have a major constraint in Montana on the in-home care components of that. We have a certificate of need law on that the governor probably can waive with his emergency powers. By the time this comes out, AFP will have an iVolunteer, which is just a website you can go to send a message to the governor and just say, hey, we think this is a good idea. At least temporarily waive this, because those folks who are in that in that vulnerable population, they can't be doing this for 2 weeks. They got to be doing this for much longer, potentially. And if we can get more startup services to serve that community with in-home care, to get tests done, things like that, it's going to be important. We don't want those folks out running around.
Yeah, and if that's out, is that going to be out tomorrow, or
it'll come out like Monday or Tuesday.
Okay, yeah, I'll put it in the video description when it comes out.
Yeah. To give our viewers a little bit of a background here, this was something that Kyle and I were talking about prior to the podcast, but it's this idea that we're facing a realignment of kind of society's priorities, and we're really moving away from, in my view at least, from this perspective of kind of a hyper individualistic kind of response or just mode of operating, into this kind of collective mindset where we're all trying to help one another and create value for one another and establish mutually beneficial relationships. Dave, for our viewers, why don't you give a little background on AFP, what you guys do, kind of your view of your worldview? Because I think that has a really interesting kind of perspective to lend to this crisis situation too.
Sure. So what Americans for Prosperity does is that we engage in the key institution of government to encourage a society of mutual benefit, equal rights, openness and tolerance, self-actualization. So diving out of those principles and kind of kind of language, what we do is advocate for a government that can just do what it should do. And we do that in a very specific way. We do that through community organizing and through creating, groups of people who are united in a vision to be a social entrepreneur, to change something critical about society, to encourage those values. So mutually beneficial arrangements. We believe that people who service one another and succeed by doing so and make a profit by doing so, those are not only just leverageable for more tax revenue or good because someone has a job, but that's a virtuous thing. That's a good thing for society. What we want to do is minimize the places in society where we live off each other and maximize the places in society where we serve one another and benefit one another. And then openness, we believe that new technologies would be open to change. We should be open to other people. We should be open to other, ways of thinking. That's why we're pro free speech. We're pro immigration. We're pro trade. And I think the openness places where the most amount of danger out of this virus seems to be, at stake. I think in mutual benefit, we have lots of things where it's like, you're right, those barriers are lowering, and we're going to be able to encourage a society more in that direction. And then when it comes to self-actualization, we believe that everyone has potential that they can actualize. Everyone has something that they can contribute to society. We don't believe that there are a certain segment of people who just can't learn that or just can't do that. And if you look at our community investments through Stand Together or through our work that we do in education, criminal justice reform, and other places, we don't believe just because you have a history or you've made a mistake or you come from a certain background that you can't become the kind of person that makes the world a better place. And that's always where we're shooting at. We're shooting at for that good. As far as like the duality between individualism and the collective, what we see it as is that there is every individual has to take responsibility for themselves and what they contribute. And that's one of the most beautiful things about this is you see not everybody, there are people who aren't, but you see a lot of people, especially young people who don't have a lot of individual risk, trying to mitigate the risk of others. And that isn't a sign of collectivism to me per se. What that signs is individual responsibility, taking their responsibility for how they impact one another. And there is a solidarity there that we should recognize and that we should celebrate, absolutely, because it's not a forced solidarity. It's not saying get on board or get out. What that is a voluntary solidarity of saying we're all in this together and taking the kind of steps of making even self-sacrifice to do so. And I think the other side of that is you look at the health food workers, the people who are manning grocery stores right now, working long hours to service people because they feel like just to service the panic needs that are going on right now. Imagine, you're a minimum wage worker here, just all day, every day scanning in those goods because people need toilet paper. That's maybe they don't need it, but they see that the subjective value of the customer is that they need it. And in this point, that reliance on them, I think is really demonstrating not only just what we value, but the fact that people are willing to sacrifice to make the world a better place. And it's something as simple as grocery stocking shelves.
So when I open up Twitter over the last few days, I am inundated with messages of there's no libertarians in a pandemic. There's the ideology of freedom and libertarianism is dead with is dead with Corona. I'm seeing that all over the place right now. But based off of what you just said with talking about openness and mutual benefit and basically the voluntary aspect of everything that's going on, like there's actually quite a bit to be hopeful for right now, despite the things that we might disagree with what's happening on the policy end. So yeah, that is a very encouraging note. That's a very encouraging note to hear, actually.
And the education side shouldn't be diminished, right? We need to think about like what bigger role did government play and that the institutions of society play in getting the information out to say, no. Even if you haven't shown any symptoms, you still might be transmitting. Wash your hands, right? Like you might not know. That sort of education component is huge. Now, some of that might have produced more panic than was necessary. Some of the institutional actors that we have maybe did not, leverage their place responsibly. But we're discovering what that means, right? We're going to discover through both the competition of the corporate to the more alternative media sources that there's a place there where you have a responsibility to say what's happening right now to fact checking, and we're going to try to balance that thing out and make sure that we're people are taking their responsibility seriously. But we discover that we don't just know it. Go ahead. Sorry.
Yeah, I would add to that too, Dave. I think we're really in a discovery phase. And one of the predictions that I would make that I ran by Kyle before we started this was I really see that a lot of our systems and institutions that we currently have are very obviously not prepared for a 21st century crisis like this. And I think that they are currently being torn down and are going to be rebuilt in kind of that different vision with what we know going through this crisis. And I think you mentioned education in particular, but I really am sold on the idea that higher education is going to be fundamentally changed after this crisis. because just the ability to have education delivered remotely and online is something that we're being forced into. So I think there's going to be a little bit of creative destruction there.
Yeah, I think there's in the higher education realm in K through 12, I see a lot of that happening too. Will people change their behaviors when it comes to preferencing homeschooling versus not? I think there's so many unknowns. There's so many unknown unknowns in that space that I don't know whether or not it's anything's for certain. Other than that, I don't think anything stays exactly the same. And I think the market innovation process that we're seeing with the need for more bandwidth, the need for more video conferencing services and things like that, that allow people to connect and learn from one another, that becomes a huge incentive to continue driving process that way. So
let me just add, isn't it great that we don't have net neutrality during this crisis?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. Could you imagine?
There's actually an order in the EU that companies need to do, the European companies need to do everything in their power to maintain the access to like the level of bandwidth or whatever. And that's just like directly contrary to all of the equality and egalitarian, net neutrality.
Kendall, I don't know if you've heard, but like 2 years ago, the internet was dead as we know it.
Yes.
So ever since Ajit Pai turned down or reversed net neutrality, none of this exists, Kendall.
Yes. This is not real.
But yeah, and we were a bunch of us were passing around an article before we recorded today, talking about that realignment process, where it's not just education and higher ed and with homeschooling and things like that, but it's also just kind of like various aspects of the economy and just kind of society. Like a lot of these institutions are probably going to be taking a second look at what actually is going to come of that. We don't know. Like in the healthcare sector, you were talking about things like telemedicine, like the way that we do things are probably going to change, and we're probably going to see a lot of new changes that come in the financial sector as well, which is kind of where most of my interest has been in the last week or so. But it's kind of true. It's like we don't really know what's going to happen. Like there's probably going to be creative destruction that happens, but like the exact fine details, like people can make predictions, but it's kind of still up in the air. Like a lot of this is still just predictions when it comes down to it.
I think on the internet space too, we do have a major battle going on right now that isn't decided, unlike net neutrality, which has really gone our way. I think in the space of the section 230 of the FTC rules. So what that is right now, and from the internet, pretty much since the beginning, since the 1990s, we've had a rule that says if you're a platform, you don't have to police content. What people say on your platform is what they say. It's not what you said, right? And by doing that, you don't have to be liable for anything they say. Although there is a process for warrant and like trying to, mitigate any kind of like physical harm that might come of someone's speech. But there's a real concern that's going on right now with both sides, both the left and the right, trying to repeal Section 215 and basically make Facebook, Google, all of these platforms, rather than being a neutral arbiter or just a platform, make them into the police of who gets to say what and what is fact, what's not fact, what's propaganda, what's not propaganda, that sort of thing. And I think there's a lot of danger there. And we could see that fight's not nearly done or not nearly over. I got to wonder what COVID does in changing that, because so much of the information economy is even more so on the internet now. And those people that are in that space, are they going to continue to be like, well, that's never going to affect me? And it's going to affect those other guys, those crazy guys on the left or those crazy guys on the right. Everyone's pointing their guns at each other and not seeing that this is a power that we probably ought to keep out of the hands of those folks and allow for those platforms to mitigate their liability rather than maximize it.
Yeah, that is an interesting thing, because like we are starting to see people that are making jokes about Corona, people that are spreading various information and doing some investigative research. Anything that's outside of like just standard opinion is pretty much being shut down right now. So it is going to be interesting to see kind of when we're looking at things like Facebook and Twitter, and which there's been the censorship issue that's been going on for years with that. So it'll be interesting to see kind of what that response ends up being. What about, because we're seeing floating around right now, $1,000, $2,000 a month per everybody. Like it's basically like Andrew Yang got into the Trump administration right now. What is kind of like, what are your views on that, and how do you think that that impacts the economy at large?
Right. So there's three concerns that we have about what the federal response should be about this, right? And what we want to see is just like how do you design a rubric to evaluate what an emergency response would be for something on scale like this, for something external like this. This isn't just just purely an artifact of bad federal policy, and how do you design a program that is the least bad that it could be, right? So what we're dealing with here is not in the ideal, but in the practical world of what do we do given this emergency. So it would be timely. We want to do something that matters in time, right? And that's a big ask for Congress, guys. That's not something that happens easily. You want to do targeted. You want it to actually benefit the people who are affected by this thing. And that is, of course, in tension with timely at any given moment, right? Because if you need to know exactly who has been, put into a bad situation by COVID-19, you're going to use time to figure that out. So that's going to be in tension with targeted. And then lastly, targeted timeliness and oh my goodness, did I just forget it? It's another T word. Timely, targetedness, and man, I'm glad this is a podcast and I can fail in real time.
I'll cut it out.
No, it's fine. The last one is timely, targetedness, and timeliness, targeted, and temporary. There we go. The thing about temporary is you needed something that lasts as long as this lasts. What we don't want is a new UBI or something that is a permanent new arrangement or new power for the federal government. And I think in the early stages here, we have some stuff that kind of qualifies in those areas. Specifically, the Republican plan that came out mid this week was somewhat in line with that. It was timely in that it basically said we're going to, as soon as possible, give everyone a check and open up a new loan process for small businesses and a secondary one for large ones. And then it basically said, we're gonna target it by income. We're not gonna spend a lot of time targeting just for people who are done by COVID. I think as far as individuals go, that makes a lot of sense because it'd be just a difficult thing to guess. There's so much diversity in terms of how people make their income and how people are affected by this. But when it comes to businesses, it's a little bit more complex. Is your business in a bad situation and getting a subsidized loan because it was over leveraged and undercapitalized to begin with and it was already propped up and ready to fail, or is it actually failing because of COVID? So that's a targeting question there. And then temporary. It was only going to be a short-term program. It wasn't going to be a new long-standing business loan, XM Bank in perpetuity. So I think as far as like an emergency relief package like that could be something that was the least bad situation we could get to. At least we're not doing, federal purchases or nationalization of the airlines. At least we're not doing, massive, 2008 responses where we're just kind of giving big checks to the political allies of our friends. Everybody remembers Solyndra, right? Mm-hmm. We don't want to just give money away to the people who are best connected to the Congress or to the administration. What we want to do is make sure that we do a broad-based, general, equal rights access sort of question.
Although we have been talking about like bailouts when it comes to like Boeing and stuff like that. I've seen like $50 billion bailouts being touted around, kind of in all these different avenues.
So, I'm just saying those parts of the program that we supported were those three, and there's a lot of other ideas out there, and we got there's some very radical ones. I think the idea that you're cutting checks to everybody's UBIs, Andrew Yang, is a little bit overblown. If only because if you remember, the Bush administration actually did something very similar to stimulate the economy.
They did like a $500 one, didn't they?
I think it was closer to $600 or $700. 600. But this and it does demonstrate the inflation that we've experienced since the early 2000s. In the fact that there's mid 2000s. In the fact that everyone looks at $600 to $700 and like, why would I want that? I don't even need that. That's but you're saying anything less than $1,000. So I think that the total amount for people making under $75,000 a year, if I remember right. Oh man, I could be butchering this. Was $120,000 or $1,200. So which would go a long ways for a lot of those folks.
It's like $2,000 for families. Then there's a credit for kids.
$500 credit. Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. I think that the stimulus stuff is interesting because it's honestly, it's arguable, but it's I think one could say that it's a necessity that we have unfortunately created because of our monetary policy. So I think that if we didn't have such an active interventionist monetary policy, we would probably have an economy and a society a lot more prepared for downturns.
Well, there's no incentives for saving anymore, and that's one of the biggest problems that exists right now. Is like you have people that have just been living way too high on the hog as of right now. So when there's a rainy day, like everybody's acting like it would never rain anymore, and that we would just be able to just go on living whatever lifestyles we want to, but like nobody was prepared for such an event. I shouldn't say nobody, but like, and the government and what the Fed's doing is no different. Like, now we're just acting like there's just infinite money that we can just give out to people.
I think there's a perverse incentive that got established in 2008, at least in the financial sector.
Yes.
That the Federal Reserve can do whatever it wants, and there's never going to be inflationary consequences. We don't know how long that lasts. We really don't understand how obviously inflation is a thing. It just hasn't been something that has been in the popular imagination, not like it was in the 1970s, as a real problem that people are trying to solve with policy solutions. Not yet. Now, and here's where it's absolutely correct. If we had better fiscal discipline as at both the federal government level, this would be far more affordable, right?
Yeah.
If we weren't already running almost $1 trillion annual deficits, we could probably afford an extra $1 trillion in an emergency. But we haven't been doing that. We haven't been dealing with the fact that Medicare and Medicaid are unsustainable. We haven't been dealing with any of the fiscal discipline on the federal level. And then and if I can unpack just for a minute the Federal Reserve policy concerns for those who might not be as familiar with monetary policy. What the Federal Reserve does is it sets interest rates for what is essentially the price of money and to get a loan in the economy at any given time. When the Federal Reserve does that, if it sets rates too low because it's a price fixing organization, if it doesn't naturally know what the right price is for money or for a loan at a given time. It has to look at measurements and it has to try to make its best guess. As an institution, it can't make the best guess for the same socialist calculation problem that any other socialized or monopoly can have. So we have a monopoly in our money supply question. Do they set the price at the right amount? Now, they have a lot of incentives to set it low, right? Because the cheaper credit is, the more that people can leverage consumption, the better the economy feels at any given time. And people's, and especially if you look at, the stock market and the leveraging of, leverage trades to make bigger profits for the financial industry, the Fed's all tied up in the financial industry. So it has a lot of incentives to keep the party going as hot as it can. And then, of course, it has the opposite of that in the in the Keynesian model to take away the punch bowl when the party gets too crazy to stop. But unfortunately, it looks like both in 2008 and 2001 and many other times in the past, the Fed has, instead of taking away that punch bowl, spiked it and done more to try to keep the party going. So I think at least a component of this is that people respond to the incentive of a low interest rate. They respond to the incentive of having cheap credit at any given time via credit cards and things like that. And they respond to the fact that if you put money into savings, you're not going to get that. It's not going to keep up with the inflation rate. So as people respond to that, they're not going to have as big a household savings. I think you see that in the statistics. Most people, when they're looking at the question of whether I save this chunk of money or put it into a 401k or spend it, a lot of people are going to wind up, basically the only choice there is 401k or spend it. And if it's in 401k, it can't be liquidated, right? And then if the stock market goes down, you can't get to that money. Or buy a house, buy a consumer good. A house is a consumer good. But I mean, like it might appreciate in value, but ultimately it's a consumer good, in my opinion.
All those millennials won't say that.
Yeah, well, it's I own a home, and it takes a lot of work. Like
it's a liability in a lot of ways, too.
Especially if you got kids, it's in a constant state of falling apart. But I totally get. People are responding that incentive. So the question is like, what should we do? Well, in the short term, we can do this to get through this emergency. But if we don't look seriously after this emergency is over at monetary policy reform, at FDA reform, I mean, the FDA is probably the biggest villain out of this whole thing. And I'm sure a lot of people there were trying to do the right thing, but they really just did not understand their own bureaucratic barriers that they were creating. I don't think they're not out there intentionally trying to make this worse, but I think they were probably the worst actors out of the federal government's response, making this as bad as it could be.
Could you maybe explain further, because like somebody that's not maybe like read into like Austrian like economists like Ludwig von Mises or something like that,
right,
or F.A. Hayek or any of these like great figures, when you talk about the socialist price calculation and how the Fed isn't able to accurately predict this when it comes to like things like interest rates, and this probably pertains to the FDA as well. Can you kind of unpack that a little bit further, because I think that's an interesting thing where a lot of people misunderstand what's going on in just general economics.
Right. So if you really want to understand this, you have to look at F.A. Hayek's The Use of Knowledge in Society. That concept, knowledge in society is dispersed and decentralized. In the economy, what we do is the role that prices play is in transferring that localized knowledge to discovered knowledge, right? So we don't really understand where the price of wheat comes from, but through a process of negotiation between buyers and sellers, between makers and consumers, we discover the price of wheat, right? There's no objective price of wheat. That's why the labor theory of value and Marxism was wrong. That's why Adam Smith was wrong when he originally talked about the labor theory of value.
Even though he was great on other things.
Yeah, right.
He was bad on this
Right,
thing.
well, and people make mistakes. I mean, this is like the first shot at something. The world is incredibly complex, and out of that complexity, we have to discover the knowledge that allows us to actually, make good decisions in the world. When it comes to the market process, almost all prices like that are discovered through a competitive and a negotiation between consumers and sellers. So in the case of kind of applying to monetary policy in the Fed, because there's a monopoly, it's more difficult for them to discover that natural bottom of knowledge. Now, we try to adjust for that by having regional Feds, and we try to adjust for that by having as competitive a banking sector as we can, but that's not really what we've had as far as the regulatory regime for a very long time. America's always been very skeptical of a very competitive banking structure. We've never really been in a situation where we've had real free banking in America. So if we can get to the if we can get to the place where there's a loanable savings market that is directly itself tied to the interest rate at a given time, where we discover the interest rate through the amount of people who have savings at a given time, then we don't need the government to bail us out, right? Because I bail myself out. I have the incentive to save in case of emergencies, which is exactly the advice that our grandparents gave us.
Yeah.
If you're in a situation, and I'm probably talking way too much, guys, sorry.
No, there's plenty.
Consider for a minute the things that your grandparents who grew up in the Great Depression were living through. What they lived through was not so dissimilar to this, where gap out 3 months of your life worth of income. Have that ready. Have canned foods ready in case of emergencies. Like, that's the sort of things that my grandmother taught me. We don't live that perfectly. We're millennials too. We probably consume more than we should. I'm responding to incentives like everybody else, but there's a tremendous amount of wisdom built into that idea. And that comes from the fact that what we used to have was largely, and under the gold standard and other monetary regimes, was something that was a little bit closer to where savings itself had a trade-off to consumption. And right now, we don't have that incentive, so we don't really have a bias towards that. Not to mention all the things that have gone wrong as far as housing, student loans, and things like that the government's done to grow the price of these things and make them unaffordable to the average person. That really incentivizes debt, too.
Yeah. I think, Dave, that something really interesting that I heard from Peter Schiff the other day was that, if the Fed hadn't been so active up until this point, if it hadn't artificially driven interest rates so low, if it had allowed interest rates to rise a little bit higher, then they would have some room to maybe stimulate this economy at some point. They would actually maybe have kind of a role here, but they have been so active, and we have zero interest rates right now. So what else are we left to do? We really are in a crisis, and I think it's of their own making.
Yeah, if you're a homeowner, refinance your home, but that's about all you got, right? I mean, the dynamic here is really interesting, right? Because what the Federal Reserve has done is they edged back and they edged up interest rates several times over the last couple years, and every time it was like, every time everyone got all freaked out. And it was like, we're okay. We can keep this going. We can keep the party going. And then you'd take away a little more punch, and everyone kind of freaked out. And then, but they couldn't do enough of that because they were too afraid. I mean, the political incentive to keep the party going is too great. And if anything, if we should question the insular nature, the professional, technocratic nature of the Fed, I think it's really disproven to be true, at least in this last, post 2008 to current period, where they had every incentive to, as things started to pick up, to start lowering interest rates steadily, and they really waited too long and didn't do enough.
So I guess the recommendation then, guys, would be, if we do end up with this helicopter drop stimulus where every working American gets, the $1,000, $1,200 for a month, the recommendation would be save it, like your grandparents would say. Don't go out and buy a new car.
Oh yeah, no, like that's exactly my response to it as well. Is like I'm not getting $2,000, $1,200, whatever it ends up being, or whatever. It's not going to change my spending habits at all. Like it's like I've been prepared for a rainy day. And I think that this kind of brings us to kind of like a broader, maybe philosophical question on just kind of the general philosophy that I think a lot of Americans have. And I think that a lot of these policies that we've kind of instituted over the last 100 years have kind of brought us in this mindset of consumption over saving, of just kind of like not really being prepared for catastrophe to happen. I think that there's like kind of like a lot of these policies, it's not only just like this is what government's doing, but it's actually kind of instilled a philosophy in just kind of the general populace in a lot of ways. Do you guys understand what I'm saying?
Yeah, there's definitely a feedback mechanism between public policy and the way people will approach their individual lives. I think when we look at the way public policy, oftentimes I'm looking at it first as a barrier, right? Oftentimes public policy is the one saying, oh, well, if you want to do that, you got to get permission from your competitors first, right? Or if you want to go to a different school, then we don't allow you to. Well, tough luck. So there's lots of areas where I think we see that natural mechanism where government institutes the barrier, but I think that the opposite can be true, where there's a positive reinforcing mechanism for a particular set of behaviors that are net socially not very productive, such as don't take care of yourself, live off of other people's labor, and things like that tend to, although having a social safety net is maybe a more compassionate way to go about it, there's a lot of disincentive to that to labor. We navigate that principle all the time in politics. We're always in this debate between should we ask people to work or not, and if we're in that position, especially when it comes to the welfare programs and things like that, what we want to do is we want to get to the place where we can maximize the incentive to actualize your potential and get out there and serve one another. If we believe in mutual benefit, that's what we want to do. We want to say, hey, it's fine if we're going to produce this state where you can, live off of someone else and get access to these resources, but eventually we want to get you to the place where you can, get that job that you need or get the education you need to get out there and be productive.
Well, right. And in the past, I would say that the kind of response to that, our grandparents' generation was kind of the generation that kind of grew up with that initial safety net that we built with Social Security and Medicare and Medicaid and that sort of thing. But I think their response to having that safety net was, well, yeah, we have the safety net, but they kind of made a values proposition of saying, well, but you shouldn't be proud of, taking government money, and you should want to get off welfare and all that kind of thing. And I think that's the stereotype of a lot of like today's conservatives. But I think that that kind of values proposition has obviously kind of gone to the wayside with our current society. And I think that now we need to really look at policy reform that would then inform a new values proposition for the future.
Well, and also I shouldn't say we as a society, but like there's kind of this element that we don't look at costs anymore. So like when we're talking about like we should do this because it's compassionate to do this like specific policy, like giving people a monthly allowance, or trying to bail out these businesses that are hit in the hard times. We're not looking at the actual economic costs of that come in as well. Is like sure, it feels good to just be like, okay, we're just going to dump all this money so that people can like survive off of this, but like there's negative repercussions that also come with that we and politically speaking, it's not useful for your political career to say that there's going to be these negative repercussions, right? Like you're always trying to promote the positive. So like there's always a cost benefit to all of these issues.
Right.
So on one side of that, I would like to talk about too, specifically in the response to COVID, when it comes to criminal justice. For example, I kind of gave the idea that there's a lot of incentive for, especially with the criminalization of a lot of the externality questions. So I'm sorry, I'm being too technical. What I mean by that is, as we say, don't get together in groups of 10, 20, whatever, and as becomes a law, what we got to be careful of is we're not criminalizing that place. Maryland, for example, had their governor came out and said straight up, hey, if you all get together in groups greater than 10, you're going to prison. That's a bad summary, but it wasn't too far from that.
But that's basically it, though. Like, that's basically it.
So the problem with that is that, well, one, prison isn't a great place for people who might be sick. Two, if you're in that situation, what we want to do is reduce the amount of people who are going into jail or prison. And we can do that actually right now through a lot of other mechanisms, not just the criminalization of assembly in that sense, but also in lowering, pretrial requirements, of increasing the flexibility for people on parole. Right now, like, imagine for a minute you're in rural Montana, you got to drive all the way to Billings in order to get to parole. We want to do is this is a great time in order to address some of those systematic problems in the justice system. As far as, especially when it comes to like people who are in there or waiting pretrial right now, putting them in jail is probably a much greater risk. So we should be exercising things like geolocation tracking, put on an ankle bracelet, put them home so that they can be in a safer situation. And of course, unless they're a danger to their community, in which we want to treat that differently. But yeah, so I think there's a lot of space in there to make reforms now that hopefully are sticky, that allow us to kind of see that this is that we don't need to have this large prison population that's very expensive and doesn't seem to contribute to public safety.
So something that I've noticed, and let me know if you guys are seeing the same thing, but I've noticed that the entire discussion right now is completely consumed with kind of a reform discussion. And I don't think that it was that way, a month ago. I think that everybody across the political spectrum is saying, what are our solutions? This is our path forward. And that's the focus of our society right now. And I think that's a really good thing. I think there's a reason to be optimistic, but I'd be interested to hear your guys' predictions of whether we should be optimistic or whether we should be a little bit pessimistic going forward, just with the light of the crisis.
I'm a bit kind of on both ends. Like, I agree that I think it's beneficial that we're able to have debates on a lot of these economic issues, because like over the last few years, the big issues of our time were like how many genders exist and like what we should do with bathrooms and things like that, which like to my autistic libertarian brain, I'm just like, I want to talk about the Fed. So I'm happy that we're able to kind of have those conversations now. I'm a little disheartened because I think that a lot of people are looking to the government for more help than we should be looking at. So I have like cautious optimism in this, and I'm also greatly concerned with just like I fear like economic depression or high economic recession coming out of this. But I am happy with there's the potential for a lot of creative destruction, and I think that we're going to see kind of a realignment of a lot of areas here. It's just that it might be a little messy going into it.
I think if you contrast this with the 2008-2009 crisis and kind of like the policy response there, we weren't even in the dialogue, not even a little bit.
Right.
Now, that partially was the partisan makeup at the time. Bush leaving office, Obama coming in, the Democrat ascendancy in 2008. That really made it a mono dialogue, right? There wasn't another side. You had, Tom Woods, Peter Schiff, a lot of those libertarian types ringing that bell saying, hey, this bailout's a real problem. It's not going to solve the underlying causes. But if you look at like Dodd-Frank as the policy response, what we have is an enshrinement of bailouts of too big to fail. What we have is like a lot of constraints that actually ended up crushing the only area where there was much competition in banking, which was the localized community banks. So I think there was the policy response has been better. But there's still a lot and I think if you look at the Republican bill and the eventual compromise, given our split government that we're at right now, we're going to have a lot of stuff to criticize after this too.
Yes.
But I think there's going to be a lot of, but we should definitely look at that as at least a partial win. I mean, having real telemedicine reform in the middle of this, having potentially maybe direct primary care or other healthcare reform ideas built into the Republican care package on this. is a non-trivial success for the folks that are most interested in limiting the government and scope.
Yeah.
I
would
am,
agree with that.
I am concerned with a lot of consensus I'm seeing on. I mean, I don't know if Twitter's real life, but I am concerned because, and I was ranting about this with you guys last night in a message thread that we had, but I'm very concerned with. I'm seeing a lot of this like, I'm a centrist libertarian, and even I. XYZ policy advocate, like we should give $10,000 this month to people. Like I'm seeing things like that kind of popping up all over the place. So I am a little worried about like the collective unconscious of this whole thing, on kind of where people's attitudes on government are going, because I do feel like there's kind of like this religiosity with the government, and just kind of they're going to bail us all out of this situation that's still there. And that's one of my big concerns that I see coming out of this, is just kind of like where the mental shift is going to go on people's like actual philosophical presuppositions on how we handle issues in the future.
Yeah, I think for the libertarian kind of lovers of liberty crowd themselves, one of the things that we need to look carefully at is how we engage in the public health question and debate. We have to find a way to communicate how the worst case scenarios are mitigated by freedom. How our ability to articulate what we think and to discover what's true is actually the thing that allows us to do the best work we can. How the government barriers, are there, and I think out of this crisis, the public health crowd, as a technocratic barrier, might come out with a lot of power, a lot of cred, depending on how the next few weeks shake. If COVID is as bad as some of them are saying, I think they come out with a very powerful. But if it comes out a little bit more of a dud, and there isn't nearly the crisis response really works on an effective minimum dose basis, or say like cases like South Korea wind up being the best case scenario where there was relatively minimal, had a very big initial push, but then very quickly had a lower infection rate due to cultural and other sorts of both policy and spontaneously ordered responses. That we'll be comparing that for some time afterwards, and as we discover that, we'll get a dose of how much of the public health crowd needs to happen through status responses, and how much should we really rely on cultural and private responses.
Well, and there's also the incentives right now, because like I saw Bernie Sanders running for president, obviously, him talking about how we need to develop a cure and sell it at cost. And like my capitalist brain is just like, no, the person that develops a cure for this thing, like they should be making billions of dollars to be able like whatever, like you need to have the incentives to actually have the innovation come into place for us to fix these healthcare issues. And just like trying to just make it so it's like there's a profit neutral way of going about this. It's just like it's completely unrealistic. The incentives are just going to be misaligned, and I just see so much sentiment towards that idea of just like, well, the most compassionate thing to do would just to be able to example something that I believe we were talking about this stuff like a week ago. Some of us was. There was an issue in France or Italy, I can't remember, where there was somebody that started 3D printing a bunch of things.
The valves.
Yeah, the valves.
Yeah.
For like $1 a piece. They were selling them for like $1 a piece, and there were patent laws that got in the way, and someone came in and sued them for basically undercutting their market and selling these things at a lower price than they were, which the normal price was like $12,000 a piece. So it was like $1 a piece or $12,000 a piece, and it's just like these regulations and these barriers just completely get in the way of us actually solving this problem. There's so much red tape to be able to go through right now.
Yeah, I had an interesting exchange on Twitter with a patent expert actually about this very thing, and specifically in Canada, how they have emergency powers over patents in order to reduce that. What was interesting to me was that his policy recommendation wasn't that they suspend patents for these sorts of medical issues, like the valve issue, like ventilators, right? Ventilators is probably the biggest constriction point, and beds, and healthcare professionals. So what we are is we're looking at, okay, how do we increase the amount of beds? How do we increase the amount of healthcare professionals? How do we increase the amount of ventilators innovation in society that allows them to create medical equipment? His suggestion was that all policymakers need to do is say that they're monitoring the situation, that they have this power, and that anyone who brings a suit is quickly going to see this power be used. He felt like that was the effective dose that would make the socially beneficial profit motive, and have on the other side of that keeping the long-term things that patents do incentivize further production. Although we can question them, especially in times of emergency, and what they as a monopoly barrier that they can't present. There could be some circumstances where we want to suspend them for a time, or at least question whether or not this is going to be socially utilitous to enforce at this moment.
So it'd be a non-enforcement kind of declaration, Dave.
Yeah.
By the IP law.
Yeah, by a governor. A government can do that, and he had actually a case of the United States having that power. I don't know. I'm just kind of I'm outside the bounds of my actual expertise on that one.
Interesting.
But there could be ways that the government can try to reduce that barrier by simply signaling that it's not going to tolerate a lawsuit on that right now. And I think most people would say that if there's a time to not be concerned about IP, it might be now.
Mm-hmm. And what's funny is that's, in my opinion, that's so much of a kind of communal response to things. It's like, put yourself aside, put the profit motive aside, and work for the benefit of others right now. Take your intellectual property rights and put that on a back seat. And I think that's a really interesting dynamic for our society moving forward.
And I think that actually looks more like real compassion, right? That looks more like the real kind of charity that we want to encourage in a moment of crisis. It isn't charity where you take from someone and give it to someone else. It's like where you own something and you leverage it to demonstrate that you really care, and you get a lot of social credit for that. That's a great thing. That's a thing that we should incentivize. On the other side of it, one thing I want to know too, Mercatus has essentially their own X Prize for things specifically having to do with this, and both reporting about COVID, on medical innovation when it comes to COVID, both in the medicine space as well as in like the physical atoms space, and then also in the information space. So there are lots of people are looking at this from a how do we solve this as a market problem, and how do we create good incentives for people to innovate and then give away those innovations so that it can scale quickly and easily. So,
yeah, that's very cool. Yeah. Whatever aligns those incentive structures is, I think, the way to go. Because and it goes back to the socialist price calculation problem. We're not able to kind of specifically narrow these things down to like the perfect decimal of like trying to get all these variables correct. So like having those types of issues for people, or those types of avenues for people to come in and create innovation, I think that's an incredibly hopeful thing for this pandemic and the next.
It'll be interesting to see who outcompetes who, like whether or not the Trump administration leveraging the 1950s law in order to take over an industry and make more medical ventilators, or if it's going to be
not used it yet.
Yeah, right. Well, threatening to, but if he doesn't, if that happens, or if it's going to come from people in their home using a 3D printer in order to make ventilators, who knows? But it's going to be interesting to see kind of what the arms race is going to be.
Oh, and if it's the 3D printers from just people at home, like that will change a lot of public opinion, I think, going forward on how we view a lot of these things and it's how we view solutions. Like if that outcompetes just kind of like the typical government solution that we're so accustomed to and we're kind of trained to just accept, like I think that's going to be a big move for just freedom lovers in general.
I think in the other space that we do have some problems with, where we're struggling to identify exactly how we're going to evolve this is to bring it back around to education K through 12. At least in Montana and a lot of other states, the way that school funding works is the amount of time a butt is in a seat for how long. And that's harder to do when you have a lot of people who are now homeschooling or doing a combined homeschool digital online space. So we're gonna have to think carefully about what are the opportunities to change that to a results-based and more innovation-based system. Now,
and more social-based, in my opinion.
What do you mean by that?
Well, I really feel like this crisis's constraints kind of put on our education system, as far as like the decision points, is what is the comparative advantage of the institutional schools versus the education ability that we have through online programming and that sort of thing. And it's my opinion that the comparative advantage of schools is the social element of getting kids together, teaching them, proper, rules for playing with each other and that sort of thing. And maybe we're going to see some of that shake out.
I think, at least, especially if you read the CDC guidance on school closures, there's an interesting dichotomy it's playing with the length of time that you close a school to, like, the fact that people aren't going to let their kids just hang around the house forever, doing inside. There's going to be a moment where kids are going to need to get together because that's the nature of kids. Now, luckily, this disease is not something that affects children primarily. So I think the risk is lower there. And I think if you look at the CDC work on that, it's pretty clear that they're trying to navigate between those two things of how do we reduce infections while also taking in reality that there is a need for children to get together and play. But on the government policy component of that, choice itself and education reform opportunities do look like they have a very clear avenue, much in like in the medical innovation space, where we need to increase supply. Well, we need to increase flexibility. Look at the COVID situation. We need flexibility in order for students to get access to the funds. Now, there was a big question about student lunches. In America, and this is less in Montana, but in America, the average student gets $15,000 annually out of the education system. If we had anywhere near that, that's a great chunk of money for people to be able to find other alternative educational opportunities. It'll be different in each state, but you get what I mean. Where if that money is on the student and on the parents to then deploy that via an education savings account or something like that, we're in a great situation which in the times of emergency, parents can align what's best for their kid and the opportunities to keep education moving inside or outside of the emergency. We need that flexibility now, but it demonstrates why we need that flexibility all the time too.
Well, and also on top of the socialization aspect of like homeschooling, like there's plenty of like homeschooling socialization like programs that are out. Like it doesn't change just because that they're in some building. I think that's a fallacy that people often look at. It's just like homeschoolers don't get socialized because they don't see the outside world or something like that. Like homeschoolers typically learn less per day, but they end up getting more quality within that. And there's been studies that show with like when you're looking at public schooling, like the actual amount of like learning time of like the 8 hours that you're in a public school, but we're talking about like recesses and all these things that come in, like you're actually only getting like 3 to 4 hours of actual education that exists when you're going through just like the standard school structure. So like there's a lot of different there's a lot of different variables that show that, but like from my experience, like I know a lot of homeschoolers, like the socialization aspect isn't a problem for them.
Right. I want to add to Dave's point about flexibility real quick, because we've focused a lot of our discussion on the federal level, on state level policy, but another thing that I think is really important that we need to assess during this crisis is actually the effect of local policy and like local ordinances on people's response to this crisis. So a really interesting point that I had brought up was local level restrictions on working at home. So there's a lot of zoning laws or local ordinances at the city and county level that actually restrict where you can have businesses. And if it's a purely residential area, there's a lot of barriers in place for folks just to completely work from home and have their business based at home. And obviously with this crisis and quarantine and with kids being sent home from school, you have to have that flexibility for people to be able to move their business from their office to the home. So not only at the federal level, at the state level, we also have to be looking at local level restrictions, because a lot of times that's where the rubber meets the road as far as barriers to opportunity.
Yeah, I think a part of this in both like the positive and negative side of it. So the local government does a lot in zoning and all that kind of stuff to reduce to increase barriers for people to be able to leverage their homes. I got to wonder what the sharing economy implications of some of these things are. I don't think that's been thought through thoroughly enough. And then I on the other side of it, I do think we do have a vindication of the federalist system on a lot of levels, where different states are responding differently. We're kind of discovering the right kind of response dosage for America, because we don't know what it is objectively beforehand. And then I think having localities be able to both get ahead or get behind based upon what they actually see. Gallatin County, for example, was a little ahead of the curve from the governor, for example, closing down restaurants here first. But then the governor did a couple days later.
But we also were one of the first people that, like one of the first counties that actually had Corona.
Right.
Right.
victims.
And maybe that's not the right dosage. Maybe a different county with not nearly the same kind of churn that in college culture would require the same amount. That's at least one criticism you can lob at the situation with the governor. Is his orders very specifically say, as long you can't, mine is the minimum. You have to do mine, and anything more restrictive you can do. Mm-hmm. And I would just suggest that the governor can play that role, but I think that there a better mental model might be how we consider the governor saying here's a set of recommendations for everybody. Here's what the minimum is, and that's relatively low because Forsyth might have a totally different set of arrangements culturally, otherwise that makes them safe. We should acknowledge that as a society, especially in a place like Montana where we're so incredibly diverse. Billings should have a different set of rules than Glendive. Why wouldn't you? They're different places with different people.
Different population sizes too, and completely different cultures.
Right. So there's going to be a navigation, or there should be a discovery of those things, and being taken seriously by professionals across the institution of government.
Perfect. So as we're kind of hitting that hour mark right now, and we're kind of coming to a wrap here, is there any like what are some things that you're optimistic about right now? And we'll close off this thing with a little bit of optimism.
Good. I'm always optimistic. You guys know.
Yeah.
No, I'm optimistic because I really feel like this is shifting gears for our generation and for our society right now. And I think that this was a long time coming. Kyle and I have talked about it for some time, but I really think that this is a realignment of our priorities. I think that a lot of people are realizing what's important to them, that their families, take priority, that personal connection takes priority, especially when we have to do without personal connection in this time of quarantine. So I think that we're finding a way as a society, and we're definitely learning as we go. But I'm really optimistic. I see a lot of good actions and good feelings and value demonstrations from a lot of different people during this time. So, including in the government. So, I think that our society is headed to a good place. But I'm biased, and that's the lens I view the world.
Yeah, I agree. Like the realignment, I think is what I'm most optimistic. Like I think we as humanity are going to get through this. We've been through a lot worse. I'm excited to see the changes that happen. It's going to be a chaotic time, and chaotic times are when a ton of innovation usually happens. And I'm very optimistic on just kind of once we get through this, it's going to be an exciting new world, I think.
I'm mixed.
I'm mixed as well. I'll be clear.
I have my rational optimist bias. I'm a big fan of Matt Ridley and his work in that space, kind of looking at the larger picture. In fact, I make it my duty to try to tweet at least one positive thing a day, just so that I'm not the guy who's always complaining. I think as far as when it comes to the deregulatory stuff, I think that we've covered really well. That there's a lot of places to be optimistic, that some of that will be sticky, and we'll be able to realize the gains from that and then keep those gains afterwards. That there's been problems with the FDA and a lot of these federal government programs for a long time that we haven't had the political will to really address. And we might be able to get to that place because I think everyone can acknowledge the testing situation got out of hand.
Oh, yeah.
But so I'm optimistic about that. But I am very cautious right now. I think we need to look very firmly at our question of openness. And are we going to use this moment to encourage the worst parts of human nature? That says that people who are different, people who aren't like me, who are come from a different place or have different values, different religions, different ways of thinking about the world, is suddenly we're going to use the force of government to keep them out because they're the danger, rather than seeing the virus as the danger. So I want to navigate between those two things and try to be happy about the things that we're doing well and having a firm look at the places where some bad actors might leverage this to do the opposite. What we need is more connection between the world. What we need is to be, if we want masks right now, the best thing we can do is lower tariffs to China. If we want medicine right now, the best thing we could do is lower tariffs to China. It's not to encourage more isolationism. It's to encourage more open engagement with the world and with people and with ideas.
Awesome. And
so we can help each other.
Right.
Yeah, and I think with that, I think that's where we will wrap this thing. So, yeah, this has been Acadian Driftwood. Make sure to give us a follow, subscribe, do all the YouTube things, as we're still kind of in beta testing on this whole podcast ordeal. And thank you for David for coming on and kind of giving his perspective on this whole thing. Give him a follow. Check out Americans for Prosperity, and especially the Montana chapter, which Dave runs. And I'm sure Dave is going to be a pretty consistent guest on this thing as we can keep doing it, because he's a good friend and kind of been a mentor to both Kendall and I over the last several years in this whole space. So thank you very much. And with that, goodbye.